Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Peah. We're up to Perek Daled, Mishnah Yud. We are done now discussing the mitzvah of Peah. The Tana moves on to another mitzvah of produce that is left for the poor. It's called the mitzvah of Leket. The Torah says, V'leket kitzircha lo telaked le'ani v'lager ta'azov otam. The leket of your reaping, of your harvesting, you shall not gather. For the poor person and for the convert, you shall leave them. So the Mishnah says, Ezeu leket anosher b'shad ha'ktzira. What is considered leket that you have to leave it for the poor in the field? You cannot take it. Hanosher b'shad ha'ktzira. Any stock that falls to the ground at the time of the reaping, which the Mishnah is going to say later on in Perek Vav Mishnah Hey, that it's the one or two stalks that fall at a time. As you cut the crop and these one or two stalks fall at a time to the ground, these must be left for the poor to take. This is the mitzvah of leket. Now, Rabotai, the Mishnah says, Haya kotzer katzar melo yado, talash melo kumtzo, hikar kotz v'nafal me'yado la'aretz areu shel baal habayit. Let's say a person was cutting a handful of grain, because the way it would work is that a farmer would take a handful of grain in one hand, the sickle, which is the curved-shaped knife, in the other hand, and he would chop off the bottom of the stalks. So if he cut a handful, or talash v'lo kumtzo, by onions, you don't cut, you pull them out of the ground. He pulled a fistful out of the ground because he has to hold on tight to it, so we call it a fistful. If he got struck by a thorn, scratched, and he dropped it out of pain, that belongs to the owner, because the Torah says, if something falls while you're harvesting in the normal way. Here, it didn't fall from the normal way of harvesting, it fell because you got struck by a thorn. That you get to keep. That's not called leket. So the Mishnah says, Areu shel baal habayit. Toch hayad betoch hamagal la'aniyim, achar hayad v'achar hamagal lebaal habayit. Let's explain visually how a farmer used to reap his produce. Now, the farmer would take a handful of grain with one hand, and with the other hand he would take a sickle, which is the long curved knife, and he would swing. Sometimes, if it was a perfect swing, that means the farmer would cut whatever grain is held in his hand, and he would use the inner part of the blade, which is the sharp part. Sometimes he swung too wide, which means he would cut with the inner part of the blade, but he would cut more grain than he was holding in his hand. Sometimes he would swing too shallow, which means he cut whatever was in his hand, but he used the outside non-sharp part of the blade. So the Mishnah says, Toch hayad v'toch hamagal. If he cut toch hayad, meaning he cut something that was in his hand exactly, but with the outside part of the sickle, meaning toch hayad means whatever was in my hand. Toch hayad, whatever was in my hand, I cut, but I used the outside non-sharp part of the sickle. Or toch hamagal, if I cut, it was a wide swing. I cut with the inside of the sickle, toch hamagal, the sharp part, but it was more grain that was in my hand. La'aniyim, the halakha is that goes for the poor people. Why? Because you have two cases here. Toch hayad means I'm holding the grain in my hand, and I swung too shallow, so I cut whatever was in my hand, but it was with the outside part of the sickle. The other case of toch hamagal is when I cut with the inside part of the sickle, toch hamagal, the inside part of the sickle, but more than was in my hand. In these two cases, whatever falls belongs to the poor people, because this is a normal way of harvesting. Listen, not every farmer is going to get a perfect swing where he cuts whatever is in his hand with the inside part of the sickle. Sometimes he cuts too shallow, sometimes he swings too wide. Therefore, in these cases, it belongs to the poor people. That's considered the normal way of harvesting. However, if they fall from behind the hand and from behind the sickle, they belong to the owner. What's this case? Behind the hand and behind the sickle, you cut more than was in your hand with the outside part of the blade. Not only did you cut more than what was in your hand, but you even cut with the outside of the sickle. That's not a normal way of harvesting. Whatever falls from there belongs to the owner. That's not considered leket. So it comes out, Rabotai, that in the first ruling of the Mishnah, it's either or. Toch hayad v'toch hamagal. If it fell from within your hand, meaning you cut whatever was in your hand, but with the outside part of the blade, or toch hamagal, meaning you use the inside part of the blade, but more than was in your hand, that belongs to the poor people, either or. But in this case, to belong to you, it needs to be both outside of your hand, which means more than you were holding, and outside of the sickle, which means the non-sharp part of the blade, then it belongs to you. Rosh yad v'rosh hamagal. What if it was the tip of your hand and the tip of the sickle? Meaning, Abotai, the Mefarshim explain, the farmer had so much stalks in his hand that some of the stalks, they were not within his hand. It was pressed between the tips of his fingers and his palm. It was so much in his hand that it was already sticking out between his fingers. And you cut it with the tip of the blade, which is the part between the inner and the outer part of the sickle. Rabbi Yishmael omer la'aniyim, Rabbi Akiva omer la'bal habayit. Rabbi Yishmael says it's considered leket that goes to the poor people because the tip is the same as toch hayad, which which is within the blade. Rabbi Akiva omer la'bal habayit. Rabbi Akiva says that the tip is considered the same as behind, and therefore the owner keeps it. Alachar the Rab says follows Rabbi Akiva. That is the end, Rabotai. Mishnah Yud Aleph discusses another case regarding leket. Chore hanemalim shebetoch hakama haren shebal habayit. Now, a person's walking in this field. He didn't harvest yet. It's still standing crop, and he finds an anthill, and he goes in and he sees that they took some of his grain. The halacha is haren shel bal habayit. That grain belongs to you. Why? Because the Rav says the field wasn't harvested yet, so there was no leket that could have fell out of your hands. So the poor people didn't get anything yet. So whatever grain these ants have all belong to me. Shel achar kutzrim, but if the ant holes are in a field that is behind the reapers, meaning the harvest started, I started harvesting my field, I only harvested, let's say, half, and this ant hole was all the way on the other side where it's still standing, and I find grain over there. The top grains in the ant hole go to the poor people, but the bottom grain I get to keep. It goes to the owner. Why? The Mefarshim explained the top grains are the white ones, which are it's ripe. It's already a ripened grain. As they come from the ripened crop, the halacha is they're most probably put in the hole by the ripe ones, right? Since it's on the top, it means it was most probably brought. The bottom grains are the green one, which is the color of unripe grains. So that means it was taken from the unripe crop before the harvest began, and usually they're the bottom in the hole. Meaning the unripe ones usually are at the bottom, and the ripe ones are usually on top. The ripe ones are white, the non-ripe ones are green. If you find these grain in the ant hole after they started harvesting, the top ones go to the aniyim, the bottom ones go to the owner. Why? The top ones, which are white, they belong to the aniyim because they were probably taken after the harvest, which means they're leket. Whereas the bottom one, which are green, definitely were taken from the unripened ones, so most probably it was taken from the standing crop, which belongs to the owner. Rabbi Meir says hakol aniyim. Rabbi Meir says everything belongs to the aniyim. Shesafek leket, because the rule is that possible leket has to be considered leket. Rabbi Meir says every crop contains some unripe green grain. Therefore, the green grains that you find aren't necessarily from the standing crop. It could very well be from the leket that fell from the harvest, and some green grain is contained in every ripe grain as well. So that could be safek leket. He says that goes to the aniyim, everything. But the Rav explains that the Tanna Kama disagrees with Rabbi Meir. The Tanna Kama says you're very right. Safek leket is leket, that when you have a doubt, you have to treat it like it's actually leket. The problem is the Tanna Kama says that green grain is already too much of a safek. White grain that's ripe, we say safek, maybe it's from the leket, we'll give it to the poor people. But the green grain that's unripe, it's very remote possibility to claim that it came from the harvested produce from the leket, and that we should give it to the poor people. He assumes they definitely came from the standing crop, and he lets us keep it. The halacha is like Rabbi Meir, that both the white and the green, both the top and the bottom in the ant hole, once you started harvesting your field, it has to be treated as leket. In conclusion, Rabotai, if we want to follow the halacha of this Mishnah, we have two cases. If you did not harvest the field yet, and you find an ant hole with grain, you can keep all the grain yourself. Because you didn't harvest the field yet, there's no mitzvah of leket. But if you started harvesting the field, and even on the other side where you didn't reach yet, you found an ant hole with produce, some white, some green, top and bottom, you have to give everything to the poor people, like Rabbi Meir says, because safek leket is leket. The white for sure came from the leket, the green, the unripe, even though it's a possibility it came from the standing crop and it's mine, we have to be concerned maybe it came from the harvested, because every ripe grain has some unripe in it as well. Therefore, it's possibly leket, and we have to give it to the poor people. All of it. That is the end of today's Mishna Yomi, Rabotai. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.